Rena had just moved into an apartment on the 13th floor, seeking peace after a breakup and the pressure of work. Her unit was cozy, but the hallway leading to her room always felt strange, quiet, cold, and gloomy. Despite adequate lighting, there was one room at the end of the hall that always caught her attention. It was different. The door had no number, and there was a small plaque that read, "No entry." At first, Rena ignored it, but she started feeling uneasy when she heard strange sounds coming from that room on the third night after moving in. That night, when all the hallway lights had gone out, Rena, who had woken up to get a drink, heard faint knocking sounds. The sound came from the direction of the empty room. At first, she thought it was a neighbor, but the more she listened, the knocking felt unusual. Always 3 knocks, a pause for a few seconds, and then repeated. The next morning, she asked the apartment guard about the room. The old man just shook his head slowly and said in a serious tone, "My advice, ma'am, is don't get too curious. No one lives there and it's better that way." Rena found his answer suspicious, but she decided not to press further. Still, the strange noises continued every night, now accompanied by the sound of soft footsteps and someone whispering. Curious, Rena began asking her neighbors about the mysterious room, but every time she brought up the topic, they seemed uneasy and hesitant to talk. One neighbor finally whispered quietly, "I've lived here for 5 years, and I know that everyone who gets too close to that room ends up badly. My advice, stay away." But Rena's curiosity only grew stronger. One night she decided to peek through the keyhole of the door. All she could see was an impenetrable darkness, like a bottomless void. Strangely, though, she felt as if something within that darkness was watching her in return. After that, strange things began happening in her own apartment. Her belongings shifted places on their own. The lights flickered unpredictably, and her bathroom mirror cracked spontaneously without explanation. The breaking point came when she started hearing the same knocking sound, this time from her own apartment door. The next night, Rena decided to enter the mysterious room. Using a spare key given to her by a friend, a former technician at the apartment, she unlocked the door. Before she left, her friend warned her, "Be careful, don't stay inside for too long." When the door creaked open, the room was empty, yet the air inside felt oppressively heavy, and a rancid, nauseating smell filled her nostrils. The walls were covered in messy scrawls written in what looked like dark red paint, like a child's handwriting. "Don't disturb me." In the corner of the room, Rena discovered a large, cracked mirror reflecting the faint image of a woman with a pale face and pitch-black eyes. Startled, she spun around, but no one was there. When she looked back at the mirror, the figure was closer, even though Rena hadn't moved. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, and a soft, sobbing sound emerged from the mirror. The sobbing escalated into a heart-wrenching scream, piercing through Rena's ears. Panicking, she tried to open the door, but it was locked tight. After that night, strange occurrences became a constant in her life. Knocking sounds, whispers in the dead of night, and fleeting shadows at the edge of her vision made her feel trapped in a waking nightmare. She knew there was only one way to find peace: uncovering the truth about the mysterious room. She began her search online. After hours of digging, she stumbled upon an old news article from 1995. The piece described a tragic incident involving a young woman named Maya, a resident of room 2003, the empty room at the end of the hallway. Maya was found hanging in her apartment under gruesome circumstances. Oddly, all the doors and windows were locked from the inside. The police ruled it a suicide, but rumors spread about supernatural involvement. Allegedly, Maya had been tormented by a malevolent entity after frequently using a Ouija board. The story sent chills down Rena's spine, but her curiosity refused to wane. Determined, she decided to speak to her neighbor, Mrs. Rathi, who had lived in the building for over 20 years. At first, Mrs. Rathi was reluctant to talk, but after Rena persisted, the elderly woman finally shared her story in a trembling voice. Maya was a kind girl, but she was too curious about things she shouldn't have meddled with, Mrs. Rathi said. She often heard voices coming from that room before she died. After her death, anyone who tried to live there faced terrible fates. Some disappeared, others fell gravely ill, and a few ended their own lives. Eventually, the apartment management decided to seal the room for good. Mrs. Ratier's words only deepened the foreboding dread in Rena's heart, but she knew she couldn't walk away now. Something about room 1303 demanded to be uncovered, and Rena was determined to face whatever truth lay hidden behind its door. Rena asked, "What's really in that room?" Mrs. Ratian stared at her with sharp eyes. "It's not about what's in that room, but who hasn't left it yet." That night, Rena gathered her courage and decided to enter the empty room. She prepared everything she thought she might need: a flashlight, her phone to record, and an old prayer book she found on her bookshelf. As the door creaked open, a bone-chilling cold engulfed her. The air inside felt heavy, making it hard to breathe. A nauseating stench, like something decaying, filled her nose. Rena stepped inside cautiously, leaving the door slightly ajar behind her. At first glance, the room looked ordinary, empty, with dust-covered walls, cracked floors, and peeling ceilings. But as she ventured deeper, unsettling details began to emerge. Scribbled across the walls were messages that sent shivers down her spine. "Help me," "Leave," and "I'm still here." In the corner of the room, she spotted a small table with a dusty, damaged Ouija board on top. The board looked old, but the letters were still clear. Next to it lay a photograph of a young woman, smiling faintly. Yet her eyes appeared lifeless and eerily vacant. When Rena touched the Ouija board, a sudden sound of footsteps echoed behind her. She spun around, her heart pounding, but no one was there. The beam from her flashlight began to flicker, casting erratic shadows on the walls. Then she heard it, a whisper, soft but chilling. "Why are you here?" Her hands shook as she glanced back at the board. The planchette began to move on its own, spelling out a message. "I am here." Panicking, Rena tried to leave the room, but her eyes caught something on one of the walls, a large, cracked mirror. Its surface was fractured, but beneath the web of cracks, a shadowy figure emerged. Compelled by fear and curiosity, Rena stepped closer to the mirror. She quickly realized the reflection wasn't hers. It was the pale-faced woman from the photo, her dark eyes staring back, unblinking. Frozen in terror, Rena turned around, but no one was there. When she looked back at the mirror, the figure was closer, as if trying to step through the glass. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream erupted from within the mirror, so piercing it felt as though it was splitting her skull. The scream echoed endlessly in the room, and Rena could feel the walls closing in. She knew she had to get out, but she wasn't sure she could leave whatever was in the room behind. At that moment, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Rena tried desperately to open it, but the door wouldn't budge. From the mirror, the pale woman stepped forward, emerging from the cracks, her eerie presence filling the room. The woman's long, thin fingers reached out, touching Rena's shoulder as she spoke in a cold, emotionless voice. "You will never leave." Rena screamed, her legs giving way, and she collapsed into unconsciousness. Rena fainted in the empty room, but only for a short while. When she woke, the atmosphere was heavier than before. The walls, once dusty and bare, were now covered in fresh, chilling scribbles. "You are not allowed to leave. I am waiting for you." And "You are next." Her flashlight flickered erratically, casting moving shadows in the corners that seemed to dance and crawl. Panic rising, Rena pushed against the door with all her might, but it remained immovable, like a solid wall. Then, behind her, she heard slow, deliberate footsteps, each one heavy as if dragging a weight. The sound sent chills down her spine. Trembling, she turned around. In the far corner of the room stood the pale woman, her long black hair cascading over her face. Most of her features were obscured, but her eyes, two gaping hollow voids, stared straight at Rena. The woman slowly raised a bony hand and pointed toward the Ouija board, still lying on the table. A whisper, soft yet piercing, crept into Rena's ears, though no one was near her. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You called me." Suddenly, the Ouija board on the table moved again. The planchette slid swiftly, spelling out a single, chilling word. "Stay." Tears streamed down Rena's face. "I didn't summon anyone. I just wanted to know," she screamed, her voice breaking in desperation, hoping someone, anyone would hear her. But the pale woman didn't respond. Instead, she kept advancing, her movements slow and deliberate, dragging her feet. Each step was accompanied by a sharp cracking noise, as though the floor beneath her was fracturing under the weight of her presence. When the woman was just a few steps away, her face became horrifyingly clear under the flickering beam of Rena's flashlight. Her skin was deathly pale and marred with jagged wounds. One gash stretched across her cheek, exposing raw tissue underneath, while her lips were torn at the corners, creating an unnaturally wide, sinister grin. Her eyes, or what remained of them, were hollow black pits devoid of any life. With a rasping, guttural voice, the figure hissed, "You should not have come in." Rena's legs gave way and she slid back until her body pressed against the door. Her hands trembled as she clasped them together, muttering fragmented prayers under her breath. She willed herself to wake up, pleading for this to be nothing more than a terrible nightmare. But the figure moved closer, her bony, ice-cold hand reaching out to Rena's face. As the fingers made contact with her skin, a freezing chill spread through her body. Her limbs grew heavy and her chest tightened. Breathing became a struggle, as though the air had been sucked out of the room. Panic surged through Rena, cutting through the fog of fear. Summoning the last shred of strength, her shaking hand gripped the flashlight. With a swift motion, she aimed it directly at the woman's face and flicked it on. The beam of light pierced through the darkness, striking the pale figure squarely. The woman recoiled violently, emitting an inhuman, ear-splitting shriek that reverberated through the walls. The sound was so intense, Rena felt like her head would explode. But the light worked. The figure stumbled backward, shielding her face with her twisted hands. Her haunting smile twisted into an expression of agony as she writhed under the brightness. For a fleeting moment, Rena thought she saw fear in the hollow voids where the woman's eyes had once been. It was the first sign of weakness, and Rena clung to it like a lifeline. Seeing her chance, Rena quickly searched through her bag, desperate for something she could use. Her hand brushed over the small prayer book she had brought with her. Trembling, she opened it and began whispering the prayer, her voice shaky and barely audible. The woman paused for a moment, then let out a low, eerie laugh. It sounded unnatural, like something deep and hollow. "Your prayers won't save you," she mocked. But Rena didn't stop. She continued to recite the prayer even though her tongue felt numb and her voice was barely there. Slowly, the woman began to fade, her figure becoming more translucent, as if the light itself was erasing her. But just before she disappeared completely, the woman screamed, "I'll be back! You will never be safe!" The scream was so loud and forceful that it shattered the large mirror on the wall into 1,000 pieces. Shards of glass floated in the air, raining down across the room. Rena quickly shielded her face with her arms, trying to protect herself from the flying glass. As the room was plunged into complete darkness, the door behind her suddenly swung open by itself. Without a second thought, Rena bolted for the exit, leaving the flashlight and all her belongings behind. She ran down the hallway, her feet pounding the floor, but the heavy footsteps behind her followed closely, growing faster as if something or someone was chasing her. She didn't dare look back, but the sound of the footsteps grew louder, faster, until it felt like they were right behind her. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her body on the verge of collapse, but she pushed herself to keep running toward the elevator. Panicked, she pressed the button repeatedly, her fingers shaking. As the lights in the hallway flickered and went out, the darkness seemed to close in on her. One by one, the lights above her went out, creeping closer to where she stood. Finally, the elevator doors opened with a mechanical clang. Rena darted inside, frantically pressing the ground floor button over and over. As the doors began to close, she glanced back and saw the woman standing at the end of the hallway, her wide grin stretching unnaturally across her face. Her teeth gleamed faintly in the dark, sharp and dangerous. As the doors finally closed, Rena felt a brief moment of relief, but just as she exhaled, she heard a faint tapping on the elevator walls. She turned to the mirror, and in its reflection, she saw the woman standing directly behind her, her hollow eyes staring coldly at Rena. The elevator descended slowly, and when the doors finally opened on the ground floor, Rena didn't hesitate. She ran out of the building, leaving everything behind. She never returned to that place. However, the disturbances didn't stop. In her new home, every night she heard the familiar sound of 3 knocks at the door, and the mirrors in her new apartment began to crack, just as they had before. One evening, while standing in the bathroom, Rena noticed something written on the mirror. Slowly, the words appeared as though written by an unseen hand. "I will always be with you.